The next speaker that will be addressing the conference is Professor Reed Benson. Reed Benson joined the University of New Mexico Law faculty in 2008. At UNM, he serves as faculty editor-in-chief of the Natural Resources Journal. Professor Benson teaches courses relating to water resources law and administrative law, and has also taught legislation and environmental law. Professor Benson is a co-author for the 6th edition of Water Resource Management, a leading water text. Before he began his teaching career, Professor Benson worked in Oregon for the non-profit conservation group Water Watch, serving for 4 years as a staff attorney and 5 as executive director. He also worked for the EPA in Washington, D.C., and for Land and Water Fund of the Rockies. Please join me in welcoming Reed Benson to the stage.
Good afternoon. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here at this fine conference. It's fun for me to be in the East talking about water law and policy issues in the Western United States. I've spent pretty much my entire career in the West, apart from 2 or 3 years in D.C., and I've been fortunate to live a number of different places. In Boulder, Colorado, a couple of times, 9 years in Portland, Oregon, 6 years in Wyoming, and now I have the great good fortune to live in New Mexico. But it's my first time to be back on the East Coast in a while, and I have to say, after 7 years in sunny Wyoming and New Mexico, I kind of forgot what it was like to check the weather forecast and see 80% chance of rain 2 days in a row. Except for a couple months of the year, days like today in Albuquerque would be considered acts of God. By contrast, though, for about half the year, 80% chance of rain in Portland would be considered partly cloudy. It's like, oh, only 80% chance. We should plan a picnic. I want to give you a very quick sense of some of the history of water allocation and law and policy in the West, a sense of the current picture, although the previous 2 speakers have given a good sense of that, as well as a quick look at the future challenges that the West faces in allocating and managing water. All of that in half an hour necessarily means a big picture, high altitude view of the issues. So apropos of that, a map of average precipitation in the United States. And what you see is the very dramatic differences running along the 100th meridian of the High Plains, which corresponds roughly to that sort of pale band. And as you look to the west, you see that much of it is red, sort of burnt orange, yellow, corresponding to 10, 15, at most 20 inches of precipitation per year on average, contrasted with 35, 40 and more in much of the east. And what you also see in the West is a lot more localized variability in average precipitation. With the wet places, other than the West Coast, the wet places more or less corresponding to high ground, mountainous areas where, at least historically, most of the precipitation has fallen as snow. So what we see is water is not only less plentiful than it is in the Midwest and the East, but much more variable across the landscape. Water scarcity and conflict, of course, the theme of the conference. Water scarcity is what we've always had, and water conflict is what we've always done. Although it's not just competition for a scarce economic good, it's a contact sport in the West. So we talk about historically. The large chunks of the West had Great American Desert written across them in the early maps of the region from the early European American explorers. And what the West wanted, a West that had little population, little going on economically, wanted very much for those limited water supplies to be put to beneficial use. And beneficial use, of course, was and is a term of art in Western water law, traditionally meaning irrigation, mining, industry, cities, sort of traditional water consumptive uses. Only in the last 30 and 40 years have we seen that term evolve to include things like fish and wildlife habitat, water quality preservation, recreation. Only as beneficial use, notions of beneficial use have evolved, have we seen state laws accommodate those non-consumptive uses, but by that time most of the water was already given away to traditional beneficial uses of water. And so with the goal of putting that water to work, the West quickly cast aside, both courts and legislatures cast aside the riparian rights doctrine of the eastern United States in favor of the prior appropriation doctrine, which was lifted from the mining camps, where the miners on the public domain in the West had pretty much worked out a system of whoever gets there first and stakes their claim has the better right to it as to anyone who comes later. Same thing applied, same principle applied to the miners' claims for water. And the West thought this works better for us than the than the riparian rights doctrine. I should mention, just as an aside, that a lot of people in the West pretty much regard prior appropriation as having been handed down on stone tablets directly from God. But interestingly enough, ironically perhaps, appropriation wasn't so much handed down on stone tablets as it crawled from the primordial ooze of the West, coming from the mining camps. So the advantages for the early West of appropriation over riparian rights is, first, that water could be diverted away from its natural course to where it was most economically important. Mining claims that might be off the river, lands needing irrigation water that would be away from the natural river channel. And also, once diverted, that water could actually be consumed. Riparian rights doctrine, especially in the 19th century, had a strong preference for preserving something a lot like the natural flow, limited the ability to consume water, but the West needed water consumption for irrigation to support this population and economic growth that the states and territories wanted. Finally, these rights were considerably better defined than they were under riparian law. They had a much more specific quantity associated with them. And it wasn't just a co-equal share and share alike among all water rights holders. These rights had a specific priority, a specific place in a pecking order. And when water was short, not enough to go around to meet all users, as happens all the time in the West, the oldest uses got the highest priority. And they got their full supply before later established uses got any. That's first in time, first in right, which Ellen mentioned. Or you might think of the old sled dog metaphor. If you're not the lead dog, the view never changes. It's worth noting that this is a backward-looking system. This is a system that allocates water based on historic beneficial use that preserves water rights for those uses forever, so long as they maintain actively taking and using water, and which gives the highest priority to the oldest uses. It is very much a backward-looking system of water law. The advantage was it was viewed as creating a certainty in rights to water that was needed in order to promote investment. We needed to invest in water supply infrastructure to maximize beneficial use of water. And without this certainty of right, it was thought that we wouldn't be able to get the investment in water that we needed to build projects. It's also maybe worth noting that states have really promoted certainty of rights in leaving existing uses alone. States have not done much, certainly not only to reallocate water, but even to push existing uses of water to be more efficient. There's been a very strong laissez-faire approach to existing water uses in the West, largely because those who hold these rights have both legal and political power. But it's one thing to have certainty in rights. It's another thing to have certainty in the amount of water you can actually get. And western rivers do not flow in a way that is that lends itself to maximizing beneficial use. This is a hydrograph of an undammed river in Oregon, the North Fork John Day. And the 4 bars there correspond to the 4 quarters of the year. And what you see is more water coming down the North Fork John Day in April, May, and June, then comes down the river the other 9 months of the year combined. So if you see 1,200 cubic feet per second as an average flow in those months, compared to about 100 in July, August, September. July, August, September, of course, being the key months for irrigation. If you look at the Yampa in Colorado, a somewhat similar situation, with the great majority of the flow of this largely undammed river being in May and June. So the southwestern rivers have a little bit different situation, but this is not a flow. This does not give water where and when it's needed from the standpoint of maximizing beneficial use. And so the states saw this as, first, our irrigators who have rights to water and need it in the summer can't get the water they need. Those with the junior rights don't get the water they need. And those high flows corresponding to the snowmelt periods are sending a lot of water downstream that we can't use. So we're not maximizing beneficial use. That water is wasted in the conceptions of that day. So what the West needed was projects. In order to maximize beneficial use, we needed dams, we needed infrastructure to store this water and deliver it where and when it was needed. And originally it was thought private capital can do this. Not so. States tried to do it with very limited success. In the end, the states had to turn to the feds in order to finance and construct these big water projects. And it succeeded in the adoption of the 1902 Reclamation Act, where an agency that would later be called the Bureau of Reclamation ends up building hundreds of water projects in the 17 western states, from the plains to the west coast, and now delivers something like delivers irrigation water to something like a fifth of the irrigated acreage in the West, and also generates a lot of hydropower, supplies water for some other uses as well. And these projects were exactly what the West was looking for, because they stored high flows for use in the dry seasons. They not only increased the quantity of water that could actually be put to beneficial use, but they made it much more certain and much better controlled. And finally, under Section 8 of the 1902 Reclamation Act, these federal projects largely operated within the state prior appropriation systems of water law. And so there's a lot to like about this. It's sort of consistent with the traditional Western attitude towards the federal government, as Bernard DeVoto described it: get out and give us more money. It's also worth noting, though, that this reflects the first option of the West throughout time for dealing with water problems. We can build our way out. The supply side is the place where the West has always looked first for solutions, at least until 20 or 30 years ago. But these federal projects didn't necessarily mean no tension between the states and the feds. Quite to the contrary. Many of the big battles between that the states, the Western states, fought throughout the 20th century were trying to beat back what the states saw as challenges to their control, their authority over water, arising from federal law. The first of which was in the form of disputes over interstate waters. In the early days of the 20th century, the Western states, the headwater states at least, argued that they had absolute control over the water within their borders. And so Colorado, as the great headwater state of all, argued in a couple of Supreme Court cases that if it dried up the rivers totally, leaving the downstream states with none, that was its right as a sovereign. Well, the Supreme Court said, no. We live in a federal system, and no state has the authority to do that, and we as the Supreme Court have original jurisdiction over lawsuits between states, and in one of those cases, between Colorado and Kansas on the Arkansas, the Supreme Court adopted this principle of equitable apportionment. Interstate rivers have to be allocated in a way that's fair, as between the states that share them. Well, that meant that individual states were less certain about how much water they had to allocate to their citizens for a water that was shared with another state. But the states in practice managed to maintain more control than that might suggest, because the primary way that these interstate disagreements have been resolved has been through interstate agreements called compacts, which are more or less contracts between the states that then become both state law and federal law. And by entering into these interstate agreements, the states managed to maximize the certainty they had in how much water would be available to them individually. Another, even more controversial area, because it involved not just disputes between co-equal states, but disputes between the federal and tribal governments, involved what are called reserved rights. A 1908 Supreme Court case called Winters established that when the federal government sets aside an Indian reservation, if it's needed to support the purposes of the reservation, water is also reserved under federal, not state law, as of the date that that reservation was created. And then about 50 years later, the doctrine was extended to other kinds of federal lands like national forests and national parks. This was viewed as a big concern in the states, not only because these rights had senior priorities, but because they were for federal and tribal lands, not necessarily the favored customers of the western states. But here again, the states managed to blunt this threat by a congressional statute and a couple of Supreme Court cases that essentially said that these federal and tribal claims would be heard in state courts, where they have largely languished. And here again, the result has largely been pretty favorable to states, because in reality, most of these claims now are settled in a way that has great protection for existing users within the states. Finally, there's federal regulatory jurisdiction. The feds have had the power since the 1800s to control water allocation and management, to some extent at least, under the Commerce Clause. This has been viewed as a threat for the states because they have always viewed water as their business, their baby, and within their authority to allocate. But here again, the states largely got what they wanted in practice because in reality, except for hydropower licensing, where the feds have largely preempted the field, even the environmental laws don't directly regulate water allocation and management, and the Congress has pretty well left to the states issues of water rights specifically. So these are examples of battles fought by the states to largely maintain their control and preserve the certainty for existing water users. And I'm giving a great deal of complex history here in a short time, but I bring this up because it's an example of some of the great battles fought over water in the 20th century. These were battles not to determine exactly how to allocate or manage water, but they were battles over jurisdiction, battles over control of the water resource. And these are battles that you could, or struggles that you could pretty much say could be addressed using primitive tools, lawyers, politicians. We're not talking necessarily about hard choices. We're talking about politically popular battles to try to preserve our water, your water, against these threats from these other guys, as opposed to figuring out how we're actually going to use a finite resource and make it work for the future. All right. Beneficial use was not yet complete. There was still, even with these projects, still a lot of areas that wanted to be able to irrigate. There were growing cities. And technological advances in the 40s meant that groundwater use became much more feasible. And we saw huge growth in groundwater use starting in the 50s. And even here, if you look at total groundwater use represented by that sort of green bar in the back, you see nearly a doubling of total groundwater use in the 17 western states from 1960 to 1980. Just a doubling in a very short span of 20 years, driven by increases in groundwater use for irrigation, largely on the Ogallala Aquifer of the High Plains. With, in addition, some growth in the public sector, largely after 1980. A leveling off since then, something that Peter referred to earlier. So groundwater use is viewed as a great deal because it's much more drought-proof year to year. The quality often is good and treatment is less. It's there when and where you need it. You don't need a big project. What's not to like about this groundwater use? Later on, we would find out, but we'll come back to that. So, if we think about water use in the West today, just a sort of a brief snapshot, building on what others have already said, irrigation is far and away the dominant use. 80% and more total water withdrawals in the western states. True even in California, with 1 in 8 Americans, the ag sector still uses about 80% of the water. In most states, public supply is a very distant second. In some states, it's not even second to irrigation. Groundwater use is substantial today, especially for public supply, especially for cities, and also self-supplied domestic and industrial uses. Hydropower is big, especially in the Pacific Northwest and in California, as a use of water and a source of electricity. And we've got high per capita water uses, partly because we've got states that don't have high populations, many of them, but also because we've got a lot of irrigation. And so my old state of Wyoming has the highest per capita water use at 10,000 gallons per person per day. Compare that with the nearby state of Rhode Island, where the great majority of the use is for cities. That's 131 gallons per person per day. So this has given, fairly or not, this has given those of us in the West a reputation as water hogs, who take long showers, I suppose, and it's created some fear that we're coming for your water here in the water-rich East. This is a billboard that was erected a few years ago by a politician in Michigan. I don't know how well this is going to show up. So what you see there is sort of caricatures of the cowboy from Texas, the surfer dude the skier from Utah, the surfer dude from California, and I don't know what to say about the hombre from New Mexico. I should have come in one of those hats, but this Great Lakes diversion project was probably never going to happen. But there was political advantage to be seen as strong on defending your state's water, something we can understand in the West. So, but today, starting really in the 90s, we saw challenges that were different and are different and are making things more difficult than what we've seen traditionally. Top 5 U.S. states in terms of percentage population growth in the 90s: Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. Dropped a letter there. Throw in Texas at number 8, Washington, Oregon, and New Mexico as 10, 11, and 12, and California at 18, but leading the nation in actual numbers of new residents. And you see a lot of population growth in the western United States. Combine that with all the existing demands, plus recognition that environmental demands are now important legally and otherwise. And we're seeing states that kind of thought that they had enough water for the future, at least unless in severe drought years, starting to realize that they don't have enough water for the future, and in many cases don't have enough water for the present as a real, genuine concern. Combine that population growth with a severe drought in the current decade, and we're seeing Western states really see a darker future than they ever saw before. But what about our groundwater, right? That's drought-proof. Well, a couple of things. One is that groundwater use has consequences. So what we're looking at is a map of Kansas. The 1961 on the left, 1994 on the right. Perennial stream reaches having largely disappeared from western Kansas, the area with a lot of pumping from the Ogallala Aquifer. Again, in a very short span of time, 30-some years. These are the streams that go away when groundwater is pumped, something that Ellen mentioned in her talk. So a greater recognition that this groundwater pumping is no free lunch. Representing not only environmental problems, but also conflicts with the surface water users who had rights on those formerly perennial streams, who are now wondering where their water went and who they can sue to get it. Plus, some of this groundwater use proved to be unsustainable for other reasons. And my hometown and home city of Albuquerque is a great example. For a long time, Albuquerque pumped water from an aquifer beneath the city, and it was thought to be virtually limitless. Better science showed that the really fat, productive part of the aquifer is the part shown in blue. It used to be thought to be limitless, now very strong, a very small area on the east side of the city. Forced Albuquerque to go away from primary reliance on the aquifer and to use surface water that's brought from actually hundreds of miles away. I should mention that the in-house hydrologist for Albuquerque, who first began raising these concerns 20 years ago, got fired. No good deed goes unpunished. It's a reflection of how resistant we are sometimes to hear this kind of news. And as Albuquerque has gone to surface water, the complications have increased because the Rio Grande is home to the silvery minnow. One of these little native species, used to be incredibly numerous, incredibly ubiquitous. throughout New Mexico, now hanging by a thread in a small remnant of its historic range, and forcing huge battles over the operation of federal water projects in that part of the state. Litigation not yet resolved after about a dozen years. So, these challenges include not only population growth, but also new listings of aquatic and riparian species under the Endangered Species Act, really accelerating through the 90s. Some examples, but really just a handful of examples of what are really, and it's not all fish either. We're also talking birds and freshwater mussels and other species. And then finally, and I won't say much about this because you've already heard about it, and we'll hear more about it, and that is climate change as a huge threat to water supply that is not theoretical, but we're seeing the impacts of it today. With higher temperatures across the west and probably drier conditions in the southwest, which can least afford them, increased water demands, not only for irrigation, but quite possibly in the energy sector as well, with a number of the greener energy options, if you will, potentially having much higher consumption of water than we've seen in the past. And what we will see as snow shifts to rain is the runoff peaks will come earlier. The shortages during those high demand times are only going to get worse with environmental and human consequences, and an increase in conflict. So, where does this leave us? Well, this is our reality now. Some might not like to admit it, but increasingly those who actually have to deal with these problems recognize that this is the hand we are dealt. The old options, build new dams, drill new wells, supply our way out of the problem, are looking more difficult than ever for a variety of reasons. The environmental laws are the most commonly pointed to factor, but it's certainly only the beginning of the story. So we are starting to see the western states really forced to think about doing things that they traditionally haven't wanted to do, to move in new directions. Things like actively managing water more aggressively than they have. The states always kind of thought they were doing their jobs if they gave out water rights and then cut off juniors in favor of seniors, and increasingly that's not good enough. States are actually looking to manage the resource more actively than they have been, and also looking to provide greater flexibility to move water from existing new uses, mostly ag, to uses where there are demands going forward, cities and environmental demands, in-stream flows, in large part. We're seeing this kind of movement begin to happen, and it's moving slowly. I mean, if we talk about change in Western water, the themes of hope and change, the states are not exactly jumping up and saying, yes, we can. But they are saying, well, maybe. We might be able to do that. But we are seeing some significant movement. California, in response to a very, very serious drought, is using some innovative authorities to try to move water where for key urban and environmental demands. Idaho, where there's a huge conflict between groundwater and surface water users, is coming up with a much more comprehensive, forward-looking strategy that includes a lot of different elements. Colorado, which in some ways is really the pinnacle of traditional prior appropriation values, over the last decade or so has really begun to revise its laws in a way that makes in-stream flow protection and restoration a lot more possible. In the Pacific Northwest, we're even seeing public funding going in significant ways to acquisition of water rights for in-stream flows. And so things are starting to change. What's clear is that just preserving state control and protecting existing uses the way states have always tried to do historically isn't going to cut it going forward. And increasingly that's recognized. So we need a forward-looking water policy that, rather than asking whether we've got certainty for existing users, really asks whether we've got the ability to meet the important demands going forward. Rather than asking if we're preserving state control, needs to ask whether our public institutions at any level have the tools and the resources that they need to address these problems. And rather than asking, as we always have, are we maximizing beneficial use? Asking, is our use sustainable, and are we managing this resource in the public interest? Thanks.